To begin, remove the front wheel from the vehicle. Unclip the sensor line connected to the lower strut mount. Remove the bolt holding the brake line and speed sensor to the lower shock mount. Remove the nut holding the end link to the strut's end link tab. You will now remove the two nuts and bolts holding the strut to the hub of the vehicle. Once removed, the strut can be slid off the hub. With an open-ended wrench, remove the three nuts holding the strut assembly to the strut tower. You can now remove the strut from the wheel well. Using spring compressors, remove the nut holding the top mount to the strut. Once the top mount is removed from the OEM suspension, place the top mount onto the Raceland coilover, slide the factory spacer onto the strut piston, and secure with the supplied nut. Slide the coilover into the wheel well, line up the top mount struts, and reinstall the three nuts holding the top mount to the shock tower. Lift the hub onto the coilover mount and reinstall the two nuts and bolts and tighten securely. Remove the speed sensor clip from the OEM strut mount. Reinstall the brake line and speed sensor lines to the coilover bracket with the factory hardware. Push the speed sensor clip onto the bracket on the coilover mount and re-clip the sensor line. Move the end link into place and secure to end link tab with factory hardware. You can now reinstall the wheel as the installation for this corner is complete. To begin the rear, remove the wheel from the vehicle. Remove the bolt and bushing holding the end link to the rear lower control arm. In the trunk, remove the cap covering the upper shock mount. Remove the nut holding the shock to the body of the vehicle. You will remove the two nuts and bolts holding the lower control arm to the hub and the shock to the lower control arm to provide enough drop to remove the spring and shock. You can now pull down on the control arm and remove the shock and spring from the vehicle. After cutting the rear spring insulator as detailed in the written instructions with this coilover kit, place the rubber onto the bottom of the spring perch. Make sure the spring insulator for the control arm is in place, and place the spring and perch into position. Lift the Raceland shock into place and slide the bolt through the control arm to hold the shock in place. Slide the control arm bolt through the mount on the hub. Reattach the end link to the control arm by putting on the bushing and tightening the nut. In the trunk, place the top mount bushings onto the coilover shock and reinstall the top nut. Snap the strut cover cap into the trim. You will now install the 2 nuts for the bolts holding the shock to the control arm and the control arm to the hub. You can now reinstall the rear wheel, and the installation for this corner is complete.